Hi there, and welcome to part 2C of the BR Standard Class 4 460 tender locomotive build. Here we see the two sets of parent stock previously worked on, located in a suitable vise, ready to separate the four individual buffers from the parent stock. For the method I decided to use to separate these buffer heads, plenty of personal protective equipment was required. I decided to separate the heads using my handheld angle grinder with a steel cutting disc in it. The buffer heads would be separated from the parent stock, leaving the buffer head over thickness at this point. We can clearly see here that the buffer head will be over thickness. It was soon decided to place the vise on a piece of sacrificial plywood, as the cutting operation wasn't doing the lawn any good at all, and the personal protective equipment was starting to suffer too. All of the four cuts being made were worked on simultaneously, and the stock rotated in the vise such that we could work our way around the circumference. A large bandsaw or mechanical saw would have been a far better option if I had had one to hand. I'll have to put one on my shopping list. This method was certainly a dirty job, but nevertheless it did prove effective. With the individual components now separated, the personal protective equipment was really showing signs of wear. Here we see all four buffer heads separated and ready to be returned to the lathe for the next process. That next process will be the facing off of these four components, and we begin the process of readying the lathe to face off the front of the buffer head and then finish the buffer head with a radiused face. I found a piece of old round bar stock and mounted it in the 3-jaw chuck of the lathe. The top slide of the lathe was rearranged such that it could form a point on the front of the bar. The angle on the front of the bar wasn't any critical angle at all. I just needed a point on the end of the bar, and I was using a round-nosed button tool to do this task. The round bar was reversed end for end in the lathe chuck, such that a dome could be formed on this other end of the bar. After a while I thought this rusty old bar I'd chosen was going to look a mess, so I found a lot nicer looking bar and decided to work on that instead. This bar is going to be used as a radius stick or radius rod, and as such the overall length of the bar needs to be the same length as the radius that wants forming on the front end of the buffer head, and this dimension can be obtained from the drawings of whatever model you're making. I carefully clamped to the lathe bed a length of angle iron. It was just clamped by 2 bolts and some steel plates catching on the underside of the lathe bed. We can also see another bolt attached to the steel plate, and this bolt head had been hollowed out by a somewhat blunted drill to form a round hollow rather than a sharp pointed V-hole. This hollow that was created in the end of this bolt would accept the rounded end of the steel shaft we had made earlier. A small centre pop was formed in the base of the top slide with a hammer and a small centre punch. The domed end of the radius rod was then positioned in the hollowed out hole in the end of the bolt, and the other end of the radius rod with the point on it was introduced into the centre pop mark on the top slide, and as such became supported between the bolt and the base of the top slide. The initial rusty old steel was put back in the 3-jaw chuck, and the very tip of it just cleaned up a bit to form a shiny point again. We can clearly see that the radius rod is far from being parallel to the lathe bed. The tool post was loosened off with the box key spanner such that the tool holder could move around on the top slide. Once loosened off, the tool post can be moved clear of the work in the chuck, while the radius rod was measured with a digital vernier gauge to be set parallel to the lathe bed. The tool post and the tip of the tool can then be slid about on the top slide, such that the centre of your chosen tool lies directly on the tip of the workpiece, and then tightened up in that position with the box key spanner. The setting up point can then be removed from the lathe chuck, and the chuck cleaned ready to accept the shaft of the buffer. The retaining bolt and spring are removed from the buffer head. The buffer head shaft is then put in the 3-jaw chuck with some paper or silver foil wrapped round it to prevent the chuck jaws from damaging it. A dial test indicator is used to ensure concentricity of the buffer head in the chuck. The buffer head is then ready for facing off and having the radiused feature put on the front face.